The door had no reason to be locked. It was a simple door. Wooden, narrow, unremarkable. It did not lead to a vault. It did not guard treasure. It stood at the end of a quiet hallway in a quiet house at the edge of a quiet town. But it had not opened in over 100 years, and not for lack of trying. Keys had been made, hinges removed, crowbars wedged and pried. Even the wall around it had once been carefully dismantled, brick by brick, but the door remained fixed, not jammed, not broken, locked, from the inside. No one had seen who locked it. No one remembered when it last opened. But the records, all incomplete, all smudged, agreed on one thing. The room behind it had once been used. Not briefly. Often. And then, suddenly, never again. For a time, people were curious. Then they were afraid. And eventually, they simply forgot. The house changed hands. Tenants came and went. The wallpaper peeled and was painted over. The hallway floor shifted beneath decades of dust and disuse. But the door stayed, closed, waiting. It did not rattle in storms. It did not swell in humidity. It simply resisted, gently, completely, without strain, as if its refusal to open was not defiance, but conviction. And slowly, the hallway around it adapted. The wallpaper stopped peeling there. Dust settled more thickly. Sounds softened when they reached the door. Even light dimmed at that threshold. Not darkness exactly, but a kind of hush. Children dared each other to knock. Some did. The sound echoed strangely, sharp and then suddenly flat, like hitting something that wasn't quite wood. One child claimed she heard breathing from the other side. Another swore she saw movement in the keyhole. Both stopped talking about it within days. Years passed. The door became a fixture, then a feature, then a legend. Families moved in and out of the house. Most avoided the hallway entirely. A few put furniture in front of it. An old dresser, a coat rack, once even a piano. None stayed long. The room behind the door remained silent, still, shut. And then, one day, without sound or warning, the keyhole changed. It was subtle. The metal around it dulled. The edge lost shape, as if something behind the door had pressed gently, for just a moment, against the lock from within. Not to escape, not to open, just to remind that the room had not forgotten. That was the first sign. The second came 3 days later when the floor just outside the door softened. Not collapsed, not cracked. Softened, as though memory had worn through the boards more than weight ever could. When the cleaning lady stepped lightly on it, she said it felt like walking over a breath. She never cleaned that hallway again. The third sign came in winter, when the temperature in the house dipped. The radiators worked, the windows held tight, but the hallway near the door grew colder, not frigid, focused, like a room preparing to speak but unsure which voice to use. By then, the house was empty again. The last tenant had moved out with no explanation, left everything behind. The mail piled near the threshold. A teacup remained full but untouched, and the key, the original brass key once used to try that lock a century ago, had returned, sitting quietly on the floorboards outside the door, facing inward. The house did not speak. The door did not move. But the room behind the door, waited with a stillness too precise to be coincidence. And something behind it had just remembered your name. Most houses creak with memory. This one held its breath. The hallway changed after the key returned. Not visibly, no new cracks, no moving objects, but atmospherically. The quiet was thicker. Sound seemed to dissolve faster, and anyone who passed through it, even briefly, came out slower than they went in. The landlord sent an inspector. The inspector never entered the hallway. He stood at the edge, wrote something on a clipboard, and left. Later, his notes read only, "Unusual density, no recommendation." A week after, he sold his house and moved to another country. Then came the historian. She was drawn by a single line in a forgotten deed, mention of a sealed interior space, origin unknown. She didn't ask to enter. She just sat near the door, every day for 3 days, taking notes. On the 4th day, she stopped writing. On the 5th, she began whispering to the doorknob. On the 6th, she vanished. There was no report filed, no missing person alert. Her belongings remained, untouched: bag, coat, pen. The chair she had used stayed precisely as it was, but no one could remember her name, not even those who had spoken to her, not even the landlord who let her in. The hallway did not offer answers. It never had. But the temperature changed again, this time warmer. Not comfort, but containment. Like breath held in a velvet pouch, and for the first time in decades, the keyhole gleamed. Not from light, from looking back. One night, just past midnight, the door let out a sound. Not a creak, not a groan, a single click. Sharp, precise, final. It did not open, but every clock in the house stopped, except one. The one in the attic, long broken, suddenly began to tick, backward. No one had touched that clock in years. Its glass face was cracked, its hands frozen at 4:17. Yet now it moved, smoothly, elegantly, marking time not as it passed, but as it returned. With each tick, the hallway grew more aware, not louder, not darker, just attentive. Someone tried to photograph the door. The image came out blank, not blurred, not corrupted, just white, as if the space had refused to be captured, as if being seen was too much like being opened. And somewhere behind the door, not far from where floor met wall, a breath continued to hold, not because it feared the outside, but because it remembered what had been sealed inside, what it had been asked, no, begged, to forget. There are places in the world where silence gathers, not as absence, but as accumulation. The hallway had become such a place. Every inch of it now seemed to remember. The way the floor bowed ever so slightly near the 4th plank, the faint scent of something once sweet, apples maybe, or tea, and the faintest indentation on the wallpaper where a hand might have rested or pressed or clawed. But the door remained the same. It was not stubbornness. It was certainty, the kind that does not shift when asked, only when ready. By now the town had taken notice. Rumors reemerged. Old men at the cafe began to speak of the house again, names half forgotten, warnings once whispered. A librarian found an article from 1911. Unusual vacancy at number 12, with a photograph of the very door, and a faint blur in the window beside it. No one had lived there that year. No one had entered. Yet the blur had eyes. The newspaper was archived. The photo, too faded to analyze, was noted and filed away. But that same night, the library's lights stayed on long after closing. The librarian sat at her desk, unmoving. In the morning, her notes were found scattered, the phrase "not eyes reflection" written 12 times across the margins. Something was watching, not through the door but from within it, not observing the world, observing itself, like a memory studying the mirror that once contained it. And then came the knocking. It wasn't from children. It wasn't from dare or mischief. It came at 3:17 a.m., the mirror time of the attic clock's frozen hour. Once, then again the next night. Always 3 knocks, always at the same time. Never answered, never repeated. The neighbors heard it. Some denied it. Others moved. Only one person knocked back. He was a caretaker assigned by the town council. Young, skeptical, practical. He dismissed the stories, laughed at the hallway. On the 7th night, he stayed behind with a flashlight and a thermos of coffee. At 3:17 a.m., the knocks came. He waited, 3 more. And then, without hesitation, he knocked back, 3 times. The same rhythm, the same pause. The silence that followed was different, not absence, anticipation. In the morning, the caretaker was gone. The thermos was still warm, the flashlight still on. But the wall beside the door had changed. Faintly, subtly. 3 marks, like fingertips, pressed outward from the inside. Not enough to break the surface, just enough to suggest skin. The hallway has been quiet since. The clock in the attic still ticks. still backward. But the door has not knocked again. It no longer needs to. There's a difference between forgetting and being made to forget. The house knew the difference. It had learned to hold memories loosely, like smoke between beams, or dust in the slant of morning light. But some memories were heavier, denser, too stubborn to dissolve. They hung in the corners, beneath floorboards, inside walls, and most of all, behind the door that never opened. When the university researchers arrived, quiet, methodical, self-assured, they brought instruments, thermal scanners, ground-penetrating radar, even microphones sensitive enough to pick up a heartbeat through stone. They were not ghost hunters. They were skeptics. They believed only in data. The house let them in. They measured the temperature every hour. They mapped the dimensions of every room. They analyzed the resonance of the hallway when footsteps crossed it. Everything was ordinary, almost disappointingly so. Until the recordings were played back. Every session, no matter the time, no matter the equipment, contained one moment of distortion, exactly 6 seconds long. A sound neither mechanical nor human, rhythmic, soft, deliberate. A thump, followed by a pause, then 2 more. Like knocking, but inside the recorder itself. They dismissed it as artifact, faulty wiring. But on the 3rd day, when they played the same file at the exact hour it was recorded, 3:17 a.m., the distortion became a voice. It didn't say a word, but they heard it. Each heard something different. One wept, one vomited, one left the house and never returned. The 4th stayed behind and asked the hallway a question, and received an answer carved into the condensation on his laptop screen. Not yet. They shut the project down the next day. Officially, nothing had been found. Unofficially, the lead researcher began sleeping with the lights on. His notes became fragmented, half-sentences, scratched-out equations, and drawings of concentric circles with lines that never touched. Months later, one of the junior assistants tried to replicate the experiment in his own home. He left behind a journal with only one legible entry. It follows where it's remembered. Back at the house, the hallway remained quiet. The door did not knock. The clock did not chime. But the light began to bend. Only slightly. Only when no one was looking. But photographs taken of the door now showed a curve in the edges, as if the space was no longer agreeing with its own shape. And the wood around the keyhole had begun to darken. Not rot. Shadow. The darkness around the keyhole deepened each night. Not spread, deepened. A kind of pooling that did not bleed onto the frame, but instead drew the frame inward, like gravity made of memory. The hallway smelled faintly of oil, old metal, something like breath held in brass. And then came the moment no one could explain. At 3:17 a.m. on a Thursday, the door shifted. Not opened, not creaked. It simply repositioned. A centimeter, perhaps 2. Not enough to notice by eye. But the morning light struck the wall at a slightly different angle. The dust settled slower. And the shadows now fell the wrong way. The house said nothing, but something behind the door had taken one step closer. Not to leave, to listen. The listening never stopped. It was felt more than heard. A soft pressure in the bones, a tug in the mind when one stood too long near the hallway's end. Not oppressive, not painful, just present, persistent, like breath on the back of the neck, waiting to be acknowledged. The house's new owner was a retired stonemason named Ellis. He believed in foundations, in things that could be measured and rebuilt. The house was old, but the bones were good. He patched the roof, resealed the windows, replaced floorboards in the front room. But he did not touch the hallway. Not out of fear, out of respect, or maybe instinct. He walked past the door every day without looking directly at it. He let the key rest where it had always lain, never picked it up, never moved it. He never tried to open the door. But once he pressed his hand flat against it. And in return, something pressed back. It wasn't pressure. Not exactly. more like temperature, warm, familiar, unmistakably human. His pulse slowed, his breath steadied. It was not comfort he felt, but recognition. He pulled his hand away and said nothing. That night he dreamed in reverse. He saw a hallway, much like his own, but older. Candles instead of lamps, rugs instead of tiles. A girl in a white dress, running, always running, from a door that had not yet been sealed. She turned once to look back. Her eyes were wide, her mouth moved, but no sound came. Then the hallway collapsed inward like a folding map. He woke, gasping. The air smelled faintly of dust and apples. The attic clock was ticking faster. Ellis began leaving notes by the door. Not messages, memories. A drawing his daughter made years ago. A recipe written in his late wife's hand. A broken watch he once carried during the war. Each morning, the items remained exactly as he left them. Until one day the drawing disappeared. In its place, a child's footprint in the dust. That evening he stood at the door longer than usual. The key was still there, gleaming faintly. He did not pick it up. He did not turn it. But the door. It seemed closer than before. Not physically. Temporally. As if every moment spent near it shortened the distance between then and now. Between forgotten and remembered. Between outside and whatever waited behind. That night, all the clocks in the house stopped. And none started again. The silence that followed was not still. It pulsed, low, invisible, rhythmic, like a heartbeat muffled by stone. Ellis heard it most in his bones, in the spaces behind his eyes. He began to hum without realizing it. A melody he did not recognize, a tune that made the hallway vibrate just slightly, as if in acknowledgement. One morning, he found the key no longer where it had been. It now rested against the door itself, perfectly aligned with the keyhole, balanced upright, waiting. He did not touch it, but the humming stopped. Ellis did not speak of the voice. He could not have, even if he tried. Words dissolved too quickly in that house now. Sentences left his lips slower than they arrived in his head, and thoughts often echoed back to him before they were complete. The hallway had begun to reflect, not just light or sound, but intention. And it was not passive. It listened, it remembered, and it began to guide. The attic clock now struck at irregular intervals, not chimes, not hours, just strikes. 3 at dawn, 5 before lunch, a long pause at twilight, followed by a single aching toll at precisely 3:17 a.m. Ellis started recording the patterns, marking each toll with a pencil on the wall by the stairs. But the pencil marks vanished by morning. Every time. Then came the whispers. Not loud, not threatening, just present. They did not come from the door, but from the walls themselves, the floorboards, even the stair rails. Sometimes they were indistinct, just static in the shape of language. But other times they sounded like names. One he recognized, the others he tried to forget. He began to see impressions in the wallpaper, not stains, shapes, outlines of frames that had never hung, the suggestion of a mirror that had never been installed. And beneath the surface, the texture changed. What had once been paper now felt like cloth, not modern, woven, as though the walls had dressed themselves for memory. Ellis no longer tried to explain the changes. He no longer opened the windows. The air outside felt thinner, less real. Inside, the space thickened. Sounds lingered longer. His own footsteps echoed slightly out of sync, arriving half a second after he moved. And the door no longer waited. It anticipated. It began to change shape, not in appearance, but in presence. One night, Ellis walked the hallway and found that the space between the stairwell and the door had shortened. By inches. He measured it with his own stride. 3 steps instead of 5. The following night, 2. The door was moving, or the house was folding inward. He tried leaving, just once. Bags packed. Car started. But at the end of the driveway, he forgot why he'd packed. He returned to the front step with his keys in his hand and a name on his tongue, a name he hadn't spoken since childhood. When he unlocked the door, the hallway was waiting, unchanged, expectant. and when he looked down, the floor bore a mark he had never seen before, not a stain, a word, written in the same carved script as the paper from his pillow. Welcome back. He did not ask who wrote it. He already knew. That night, he didn't sleep. Not because of fear, but because sleep felt misaligned, as though dreaming now belonged to the house, and closing his eyes would give it permission to enter deeper. He sat in the parlor with the lights off, watching the hallway from a distance. The shadows moved, not quickly, not randomly. They followed the breathing, his and another, and the ticking. The attic clock, though unseen, grew louder. Each backward tick now struck like a drum. With every pulse, Ellis felt the air between him and the door grow thinner, more shared, less private, less his. It was no longer a question of whether the door would open, but when. The house no longer creaked. It breathed. Wood did not settle. It sighed. The floor did not groan. It exhaled. The difference was subtle, but Ellis heard it. More than that, he understood it. The sounds no longer came from stress or age. They came from awareness, from memory. He had begun to speak less, move slower. Not out of fatigue, but calibration, matching the rhythm of the space. His thoughts no longer belonged entirely to him. They hovered slightly outside his body, like light diffused through fog, waiting to be recalled. He began writing notes to himself, not to remember, but to prove the memories had existed at all. The key had not moved again. But the lock changed daily. Some mornings it was brass, other times iron. Once it was bone, smooth, pale, unnervingly warm. Each day Ellis paused to study it. He never tried to insert the key. The key remained the same, untouched, unchanged. But the lock evolved. He began to dream more vividly. Each night, the same hallway. But not his. A hallway remembered differently. The wallpaper shifted, blue instead of brown. The lamp flickered, gas-fed instead of electric. And there were voices, not calling to him, but rehearsing something they had said long ago. He was not a participant. He was an echo. By the seventh night, he no longer woke surprised. He expected the dreams. He began to sleep beside the door. He moved a chair to the hallway, just outside the reach of the shadow, but within sight of the door. There, he sat through the night with a journal in his lap and a pencil he never used. He began to hum the tune he couldn't name, letting it float between walls as if to feed the quiet. And the house listened. On the 11th night, he awoke to find the door slightly ajar, only a sliver, less than an inch, but it had never moved before. He didn't panic, didn't move, didn't even breathe too loudly, just observed. The air was warmer, not like summer, like breath, familiar, shared breath. He stood, approached, and placed one fingertip on the edge of the wood. The door did not resist, but it did not open further. It waited. The lock was gone, not broken, gone, as if it had never been needed. He sat back down. The hallway felt different now, not threatening, not even strange, just returned, as though the house had finally remembered what it had forgotten, or forgiven what had been withheld. Ellis folded the journal shut without writing a word. He no longer needed proof. He was the memory now. The next morning the hallway was shorter, only 4 paces long now. Ellis walked it again and again, counting. 4 paces, always 4. The 5th step never landed. It folded, turned inward, became the first again. The geometry was misbehaving, or perhaps finally behaving as it always wanted to. The house had ceased to obey architecture. It now obeyed intention. And Ellis's intention was no longer to leave. That realization came not with dread, but with calm. He was no longer occupying the house. He was part of its memory. Ellis no longer spoke aloud. There was no need. The walls had grown fluent in silence. The floor remembered the weight of his steps. The ceiling tracked his breathing. Words became redundant, too clumsy, too slow. Now he communicated through presence alone, through pause and proximity. The room behind the door had not opened further, but it no longer felt separate. Its edges had blurred. The threshold had become a place, not a boundary. Crossing it, even by thought, left residue. Ellis sometimes caught glimpses in mirrors that no longer reflected his present shape. A younger face, a girl's hand, a door opening inward. He never turned his head quickly. Some memories were not meant to be startled. He noticed small changes daily. The doorknob had begun to tarnish in reverse, growing shinier with time. The baseboard grew new scuff marks that matched no known shoe. Dust gathered in perfect circles like forgotten clocks. He found a book on his nightstand that he didn't own. Worn leather, no title, pages blank except for one, which read, "You're almost there." He did not question where the book came from. He simply placed it on the floor near the door. The following morning, the book was open to a different page. This one showed a floor plan of the house, but with one extra room, the room beyond the door. He studied it for hours. The dimensions didn't make sense. Curves where there should be corners, lengths that exceeded the house's footprint. One hallway looped back into itself. Another ended in a mirror. The door on the plan was drawn open. Ellis left the floor plan untouched. That night, the hallway grew longer again. 7 paces, then 9, then 11. The space stretched, not away from the house, but inward, as though memory needed room to breathe. He heard laughter behind the door, soft, childlike, echoing in loops. The next morning, the mirror at the end of the hall reflected not his form, but the back of his own head. He turned around. Nothing there. When he turned back, the mirror was blank. He whispered to it, just once. "Am I inside now?" No reply came, but the hallway, briefly, hummed. That evening, the final pencil mark appeared on the stairwell wall. He didn't make it. It read, "Open it tomorrow." He left the lights on that night, but the house dimmed them anyway. Sleep came slowly. And when it did, it was not restful, it was recursive. He wandered the same hallway in dream, but each time he reached the door, it was further than before, as though memory now demanded effort, as though some final truth lay just beyond his willingness to remember. When he awoke, the door was closed again, but the key was gone, and in its place, pressed gently into the wood, was the outline of a hand, his own. He did not touch it, but the door felt touched, as though time itself had reached out from within and knocked. Ellis, for the first time, wondered if the door had ever been locked at all. The morning was wrong. The sun rose from the west. Ellis watched from the kitchen window as golden light bent across the yard in unfamiliar angles, painting the house in backward shadow. The birds did not sing. Instead, the trees whispered, not leaves rustling, but actual words, just beneath the edge of language. A prayer, a warning, a welcome. He made tea without thought. The kettle whistled, but the sound arrived late, as if remembering itself. Every object in the kitchen seemed to hesitate before use. The chair creaked before he sat. The spoon rippled before stirring. The cup was warm before the water touched it. It was the day he had been told to open the door. He did not rush. The hallway greeted him like an old coat, familiar, worn, perfectly fitted. The light inside had changed again, no longer yellow or gray, but the soft amber of memory at dusk. Each footstep sounded twice, once in the moment, once from long ago. He reached the door and placed his hand where the key had once been. It opened without effort. No creak, no protest, just a breath. Inside, the room was both smaller and deeper than expected. It had no furniture, no windows, no ceiling he could see. Only walls, tall, curved, and shifting in texture. Not wallpaper, not paint, something closer to parchment, the kind that held words not yet written. At the center, a chair. And on the chair, a child's coat. He recognized the coat. Not because it was familiar, but because it was impossible. He had seen it before, in a photograph burned decades ago, in a dream he never finished, in a memory that wasn't his alone. It was small, wool, pale blue, a single button missing, a name stitched inside the collar, not his. He knelt beside it, no dust on the floor, no drafts. The room did not echo, but it vibrated, like the hum of something long dormant beginning to stir. He looked up and saw the walls shifting again, not changing, revealing. Images surfaced, hands, a hallway, a door closing from the inside, not slammed, chosen. The coat lifted itself from the chair and hovered, not high, just enough to sway. The air around it pulsed, the fabric trembled, then it fell gently to the floor and folded itself. Ellis wept, not from sadness, from recognition. He had not returned. He had been expected. He did not leave the room. He did not need to. The door remained open behind him, but it no longer mattered. He was no longer on one side or the other. He was within. The space had accepted him, not as intruder, not as guest, as memory. And when the hallway shifted again, the house made no sound. Only the ticking remained, from nowhere and everywhere. Outside, the wind moved through the trees in a pattern that matched no weather. It carried no chill, no scent of leaves or soil, only memory. The garden gate creaked, though it hadn't been touched in years. The shadows no longer aligned with the sun, but with some forgotten shape of time. Ellis stood at the threshold, no longer wondering what was next. He was inside the story now, and the story remembered him. There is a silence that only old houses know, one made not from emptiness, but from listening. The house had settled into it completely. The walls no longer groaned. The floor did not flex. The ticking remained, but it was softer now, less mechanical, more contemplative. Ellis no longer moved through the house so much as within it. His actions had become echoes of themselves, each gesture layered over a dozen others from before, some his, some not. He would reach for the teapot and find it already warm. He would turn toward the window and catch a glimpse of his silhouette just finishing the same motion. The door no longer mattered, not because it had disappeared, but because it had spread. Its geometry had leaked into the rest of the house. Now every wall felt like a threshold. Every hallway bent slightly inward. Mirrors reflected moments that hadn't happened yet. The front door opened to the same gray sky regardless of hour, and the clocks, those ancient instruments Ellis had once restored with care, now ticked in mismatched rhythm, sometimes forward, often backward. He began to sense that the house was no longer following time's line, but its depth. Sometimes he would wake in the morning with soot on his hands. Other times, flower petals in his shoes. Once, a child's drawing in his pocket, scrawled in red crayon, a house, a door, and a circle inside the circle. Ellis did not question these things. He only placed them in a wooden box by the fireplace, which now burned without fuel. That box grew full. Inside it, buttons, ribbons, yellowed notes, a photograph of a woman he never met, but remembered deeply. On its back, written in a delicate hand, were the words, "Not again." He began hearing footsteps in the attic, light, deliberate, familiar, but when he climbed the stairs, the door would be locked, not with a key, with time itself. So he stopped climbing. Instead, he listened. Sometimes the footsteps paused. Sometimes they matched his breath. On the 13th night, he heard a knock at the front door. 3 soft taps. When he opened it, there was no one there, only a reflection of himself, but younger, smiling. And behind the reflection, in the distance, the hallway stretched, not into the house, but into memory itself. He closed the door gently, not out of fear, but reverence. There are doors meant to open, and others meant to remember you were there. That night, as he sat by the fireplace, the box beside him trembled. Once, then again. And when he lifted the lid, It was empty. Not missing. Returned. He never found the photograph again, but some nights, as the house folded around his thoughts, he would see her shadow in the window glass, standing just behind him, as if waiting for him to remember the rest. And each time he turned, he saw nothing, except the memory of having almost seen. Some doors, it seemed, never truly closed. They simply waited behind the eyes and blinked. By the 14th day, Ellis stopped checking the time. The clocks had long given up their rhythm, but now even sunlight came in pulses. Morning did not arrive. It resurfaced, familiar, but altered. Light stretched in strange diagonals, illuminating dust that swirled without gravity. The house had become something between stillness and story. Each object felt like a sentence. Each room, a paragraph unfinished. He moved less, yet felt more. The creak of a board underfoot no longer startled. It conversed. A door ajar was not neglected. It was thinking. Even silence now was shaped like anticipation. The hallway behind the door was always longer when he looked for it, and shorter when he didn't. He had begun to trace the patterns on the walls with his fingers, spirals, loops, a rhythm he felt more than saw. They seemed random at first, but then repeated in intervals only memory could detect. Once, while tracing a particularly long curve in the stairwell, his fingertip passed over a section that felt warmer. Not in temperature, but in emotion, like regret or joy remembered. He lingered there. That night, the curve appeared in his dream, not on the wall, but in the sky, stitched into the clouds like thread pulled through parchment. He followed it in sleep, walking through versions of the house that no longer existed. One had no roof, another had no corners, and one was entirely mirrors, but none reflected him. When he woke, he found the same pattern etched faintly onto his forearm. It vanished before noon. He had stopped expecting explanations. What replaced them was something gentler, an acceptance without submission. The house no longer needed to prove anything to him. It simply offered itself in layers. A window he never opened now revealed a room he had never entered. It looked like a study, but with chairs facing inward toward a table with no center. Ellis sat at the threshold, unwilling to cross but unable to leave. He spent hours there, watching the dust form sentences in the light. The words never lasted more than a blink, but once he caught one fully formed. Stay. It wasn't an invitation. It was a confirmation. He wept again, not for loss, but for recognition. There was something in being remembered by something that should have forgotten you. Later that evening, the house let out a single sound. Not a groan, not a sigh, more like a note from an instrument no one remembered how to play. It rang once, then folded back into the silence, leaving Ellis breathless. He walked the halls again, slower now, touching the walls not to feel them, but to be felt by them. In the mirror by the entryway, his reflection remained, but it had aged, not forward, but sideways, and when he blinked, it did not. He stood there a long time, unsure which side of the glass he now occupied. Somewhere, a clock chimed 13, and then forgot what it meant. The house, it seemed, was remembering too fast, and forgetting beautifully. The days no longer stacked neatly. Ellis stopped counting them because they no longer behaved like days. Some were shorter than a thought. Others stretched like waiting. Meals occurred out of habit, not hunger. Sleep arrived not with darkness, but with memory. And waking. Waking was sometimes just remembering what it felt like to be awake. The house did not decay. It adjusted. Mold did not grow, but colors faded where no light touched. Metal tarnished only on its untouched side. A single window bloomed frost in the shape of vines, even in summer. And behind the wallpaper in the north hallway, Ellis found writing, script too faded to read, except for 2 words. You stayed. He did not remember writing it. Other messages began to appear in quiet places, inside cupboard doors, beneath floorboards, on the undersides of drawers. each one written in a hand that wasn't quite his, but close enough to unsettle. Don't follow the ticking. She remembers your name. This isn't the first time. He began to collect them, folding each message carefully and placing it into a wooden box, the same one that had once held tokens from another silence. This box, too, filled slowly, but its contents did not rest. Sometimes he would lift the lid to find new arrangements, as if the notes had argued overnight and settled into compromise. He asked no one if this was real. There was no one to ask. Instead, he began to respond. He wrote messages of his own, short questions, small truths, confessions in the margins of silence. He left them where the others had been found, under the rug, inside the chimney, beneath the loose brick by the cellar. And in time, replies came, not always in ink. Once, a spoon bent into a spiral was left on his nightstand. Once, a lock of hair curled inside a clock's casing. And once, the house rearranged itself, not the walls or furniture, but the memories tied to them. The chair in the study now carried the warmth of another's sigh. The mirror near the stair reflected a child's handprint for just a moment before fading into silver. The house was no longer keeping him. It was remembering with him, and that made all the difference. He began to understand that memory was not linear here. It spiraled. The more he remembered, the more the house gave back. A drawer he hadn't opened in months now held a scarf he had lost as a child. A crack in the plaster formed the outline of a town he had once visited only in dreams. The house was less a place now, and more an index of everything that had ever touched him deeply and refused to leave. One evening, while staring into the embers, a final note appeared on his lap. It said, "Ask her." He looked up, and in the mirror, she was already waiting. Not in the mirror's glass, but in its memory. And the mirror blinked first. Ellis smiled, not with joy, but with understanding. She was not a woman he remembered, not clearly, not in photographs, not in names, not in the reliable structure of past time, but her presence was undeniable, like the scent of rain before it falls, or the hush before a symphony begins. She stood in the mirror without weight, without sound, but with gravity. Ellis did not approach. He sat, and the mirror softened. It did not shimmer. It breathed, contracting gently around her outline, as if the glass was not separating them, but remembering the shape of her. She did not speak, but she conveyed. Her gaze moved through him, not past, not at, but within. It stirred moments he hadn't stored as memories. A cup of tea cooling on a porch that never existed. A lullaby hummed in a room with no cradle. A farewell whispered with no voyage to follow. These were not visions. They were returns. And Ellis, without knowing why, placed his palm to the mirror. It met resistance, not cold, not hard, but dense with meaning. The reflection did not mirror his gesture. She placed her palm lower, to his chest. And though glass remained between them, he felt the weight of that touch. Not pressure, but acknowledgement. A heartbeat, not his, echoed behind the glass. Then something shifted, not in the mirror, but in him. A recollection, sharp and sudden. A child's laugh behind closed doors, a storm never spoken of, a door that should have never opened, and one that never truly closed. It came not as image, but as sensation. Warmth behind the ribs, grief below the lungs, a longing housed in bone. He dropped his hand and looked away, not from her, but from the moment itself. Too much, too soon. When he looked back, she was seated. The room in the mirror had changed. It no longer mimicked his own, but hinted at a version untouched by time. Wallpaper unpeeled, curtains unfrayed, a clock ticking steadily above the hearth. The room looked ready. She waited. Not with impatience, but with certainty. She was not asking him to remember her. She was asking if he would accept that he already had. Ellis stood, not abruptly, but with the grace of something long rehearsed. He faced the mirror, not as a barrier, but as a door. not to pass through, but to witness fully. He did not raise his hand this time. He simply nodded, and the mirror responded, not with light, but with stillness. Everything in the room behind her stopped. The clock, the fire, even the soft movement of dust. It was a silence not of absence, but of agreement. The reflection remained, but she was gone. In her place, the chair, empty, except for a folded note. He leaned in to read it, and though the glass never opened, the words arrived clearly. You never left. And behind him, the ticking began again, but this time it ticked in rhythm with his breath, and the house exhaled. For the first time, it felt like rest. There are moments when time does not move. It listens. Ellis remained by the mirror long after the note had faded. He did not read it again. He did not need to. Its meaning had lodged itself somewhere deeper than memory, somewhere quieter than thought. It had not told him anything new. It had only confirmed what the house had whispered all along. He was not visiting. He had always been here. He moved differently after that. Not slower, not faster, more honestly. He began to see layers in the house he had once overlooked, a pattern in the floorboards that matched the rhythm of his old journal entries. A doorframe nicked at the exact height of a childhood scar. Even the crack in the ceiling above his bed traced the silhouette of someone waiting, with arms open. It wasn't the house revealing itself. It was memory rearranging the world to match its own map. One morning he found the attic unlocked. No sound called him there. No mystery compelled him, only understanding. He climbed the stairs not as a searcher, but as someone returning to a room he once left gently. The attic smelled of cedar and candle wax. Dust hung in the air like time suspended. There were no cobwebs, only preservation. At the center stood a chair, and beside it, a box, not the same one he had filled downstairs. This one was older, worn, the lid bowed inward from decades of breathless waiting. He opened it. Inside were items he had never seen but recognized immediately. A ribbon he once gave to no one, a photograph never taken, a key to a lock that never existed. These were not keepsakes. They were anchors, objects that tethered feelings to form, moments to matter. As he lifted each one, the attic shifted, not physically but narratively. It was no longer a room above the house. It was the house's heart. He sat in the chair, holding the key. Not to use it, to remember why it had once mattered. And in that stillness, something long dormant stirred. Not in the attic, in him. A pulse that did not beat, but echoed. A rhythm once lost beneath routine, now returning in full. The house exhaled again, and this time Ellis heard it clearly. It was not air. It was music. Not notes, not melody, but memory made audible. He closed the box slowly, placed it on the floor, and whispered, "I'm ready." No door opened, but one closed, somewhere deep inside the silence, and the ticking paused, as if nodding in approval. Then it resumed, not behind him, within him, and the attic, now emptied of mystery, became something simpler, a place not to wonder but to wait, for the rest to return, and for nothing to be forgotten again. Ellis smiled, because even silence, it seemed, had a memory, and he had become part of it, not remembered, remembering, forever. And so the house remained, not waiting for him, but breathing with him, in rhythm, in rest. The house had always contained a certain kind of silence, but now it was no longer empty. It was saturated, not with noise, but with presence, with awareness, with something like memory that had grown legs and begun to walk alongside Ellis. He no longer wandered the halls. He accompanied them. Each corridor had grown subtly different, not visibly, but in the way air thickens before thunder. The rooms had learned to breathe at his pace. The floor creaked, less from age and more in response, each groan a kind of welcome. Even the shadows no longer fled from light, but watched it, as if recalling what it once meant. He no longer opened doors expecting rooms. He opened them expecting recollection. One such door led to the room with the sealed fireplace. He had passed it hundreds of times before, never curious, but now it felt different. Not inviting, but yielding, like a page that had waited too long to be turned. He stepped inside and stood for a long while. Nothing moved. The room was modest. A faded rug, a cabinet with no handles, and the fireplace, bricked up with a neatness that suggested it had been intentional, ceremonial even. On the mantel sat a single item, a black and white photograph of the room itself. But in the photograph, the fireplace was open, and someone stood in front of it. Someone he could not see clearly, yet recognized without doubt. He picked up the photograph. It was heavier than it should have been, not in mass, but in gravity, as though lifting it altered more than muscle. On its back, in faint pencil, a date. August 2nd. No year, no context. He placed it back. Then, almost without intention, he reached toward the bricked fireplace. His fingers brushed one of the center stones, and it was warm, not just from sunlight or air, but from memory, from use, from significance. That night, the room visited him in his sleep, not as a dream, but as a version of itself, awake, unfinished. The bricks were gone, and fire roared in the hearth. The figure from the photo stood with back turned, humming a tune that did not echo. Ellis tried to speak, but the room had no words for him, only the hum and the fire, and the knowing that he was not meant to interrupt, only witness. When he woke, ash clung to his fingertips. He washed his hands, but the scent of smoke lingered, not unpleasant, not choking, familiar in the way old books smelled of dust and breath. The room, when he returned to it, looked unchanged, but felt less so. The photograph was gone. In its place, a small stone, rounded, smooth, and warm. He did not question it. He carried it in his pocket the rest of the day, and when he sat again that night in the attic, listening to the house breathe, he felt it press against his leg with the gentlest insistence. Not demanding, not reminding, just present. Like something that had returned from far away and needed no introduction. Like something that had always known the way back. Ellis did not speak to the house, but he knew it listened. He knew it because the wind no longer howled through the eaves. It conversed. The floorboards beneath his steps adjusted subtly to his gait, like a dance partner learning his rhythm. Even the dust motes in the air seemed less aimless, drifting in spirals that echoed the patterns he traced with his fingers at night. He had stopped waiting for the extraordinary. The extraordinary had become ordinary. One morning, while opening a window that never used to open, he found a folded letter tucked between the panes. No name, no seal, only a single sentence. You almost remembered everything. He read it once, then again. But it did not change. The words were not meant to reveal, but to confirm. He carried the letter with him for days, tucked into the spine of a book he never opened. He didn't need to. The sentence lived with him now. It was less a statement and more a mirror, reflecting a shape he almost recognized. Rooms he had never entered began to offer themselves, not by unlocking, but by unfolding. He would turn a corner and find a corridor where none had existed, not new, reinstated, as if the house was remembering too and its recollections were architectural. One such hallway led to a staircase he did not descend, but rather returned to. At the bottom, a door. It was already ajar. Inside was a study, not dusty, not decayed, preserved. A fire burned in the hearth, though no one had lit it. A desk faced the wall, not the window, and on it lay a journal. Its cover matched the one he had found weeks ago. Worn leather, familiar stitching, the scent of old questions. But this one bore no title, only an indentation where a name had once been pressed, now erased. He did not open it. He sat in the chair, placed both hands on the desk, and waited. The fire did not flicker. The shadows held their breath. And slowly, Words began to form on the open page. Not ink, not light, but something between. A script that revealed itself only when unlooked at. He closed his eyes. Let them come. Then opened them, and read what was already within him. The journal spoke in echoes, not sentences. Fragments of childhood laughter. The creak of a porch swing. A name whispered before sleep. None of it was narrative. All of it was true. When he reached the end of the page, no new words appeared. Only a small pressed flower, dried, intact, and fragrant with a memory he could not name. He touched it gently, and for a moment forgot where he was. Not lost. Returned. When he closed the journal, the fire dimmed. Not extinguished, but satisfied. And behind the chair, a door that had never been there before waited without urgency. He did not open it. Not yet. But he stood, ready to walk toward it, not to escape, but to arrive. Wherever it led, he already knew the way. The new door was not dramatic. It had no ornate carvings, no handle of brass or bone. It was plain, wood darkened by age, not artifice. But it pulsed slightly, as if aware of being watched. Ellis placed a hand on the frame and felt, not temperature, not texture, but recognition, like running your fingers across a name you once knew how to spell. He opened it without expectation. Beyond it lay another hallway, long, still, lit only by a series of wall sconces that cast no shadows. Each step forward felt like walking through a moment rather than a space. The hallway was lined with doors, each identical, each slightly ajar, as if caught mid-thought. Ellis did not try to open any of them. He simply walked and let the space unfold. From some rooms he heard nothing. From others, the faintest echoes, pages turning, water dripping, a piano chord held too long. Not sound. Memory's shadow of sound. Halfway through the hall, he stopped. There was no cause, only stillness. And then a breeze passed, not from behind or ahead, but from within the walls. A quiet exhale, and with it, one door creaked wider than the rest. He turned toward it. It did not beckon. It waited. Inside, the room was not a room. It was a forest, dense, quiet, and lit from no discernible source. The air was cool and smelled of pine, though no windows opened to the outside. Trees did not grow from the floor. They were the walls. Branches curved overhead like cathedral arches. Beneath his feet, moss cushioned every step, and between roots, objects were nestled. A photograph in a silver frame, a pair of shoes small enough for a child, a mirror that reflected only movement, never form. He wandered without aim, but not without direction. Something guided him, not a voice, but a rhythm, a pulsing, like a second heartbeat buried beneath the ground. At the forest's center stood a clock, tall, still, unwound, but ticking. Each tick was faint, not mechanical, but organic, like a seed opening or a breath beginning. Ellis reached for it, not to touch, but to listen. The face had no numbers, only one hand, and behind the glass a single drop of water suspended in motion, trembling with restrained fall. He stood there a long time, unsure whether he was waiting for it to fall, or had already seen it fall in another life. Then something shifted behind him. He turned and found himself back in the hallway. The door he had entered through was closed, and this time, locked from the inside. He did not try to open it. Instead, he turned to face the hallway ahead, now altered. Fewer doors, more light, and at the far end, a flicker of movement not meant to be chased, only followed. And so, he walked, not as a visitor, but as one finally being remembered, and every step was no longer forward, but inward, toward a center that had always been waiting, not to be found, but to be felt. The corridor narrowed, not by architecture, but by atmosphere. The air thickened, not with pressure, but with memory. It was as if the house was leaning in, listening to each of Ellis's steps. Light no longer came from the sconces. It seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, soft, pulsing like breath caught in plaster. He passed no more doors, only impressions, faint outlines of thresholds that might once have been. They didn't ask to be opened. They had already served their purpose. At the end of the corridor stood a mirror, not reflective, just present, like a witness who'd waited too long to speak. Ellis approached, slowly, not out of fear, but reverence. The mirror was old, not in appearance, but in posture. It did not shine. It absorbed. It offered no reflection of the corridor or of Ellis himself. Instead, it shimmered with something softer than image, recognition without clarity, a remembering without proof. He reached out, fingertips brushing cool glass, and for a moment, the surface resisted, like still water remembering how to ripple. Then it yielded, not breaking, not opening, just allowing. A warmth spread through his hand, up his arm, settling behind his ribs. Not heat, invitation. And the mirror whispered, not in sound, but sensation. You are not outside looking in. You are inside, looking forward. With that, the mirror faded, not vanished, just dimmed. And behind it, a room emerged. It had no walls, yet he could not see beyond it. It had no furniture, yet he did not feel unwelcome. It was a space that remembered being many things: a nursery, a study, a sanctuary, a void. The floor felt like wood, but gave beneath his steps like grass. The ceiling held no light source, but everything was visible. In the center lay a circle of stones, 12 of them, each marked with a symbol he almost understood. Not letters, not numbers, more like moments pressed into shape. He stepped inside the circle, and the air changed. Not colder, not warmer, just quieter. As though he'd stepped into the breath between memory and meaning. He knelt by one of the stones. It was warm, not recently touched, recently remembered. The symbol upon it flickered briefly, like a thought forming and dissolving at once. He did not try to decode it. Understanding was not the point. Presence was. He moved clockwise, touching each stone, and with each contact, a faint memory stirred. Not visual, not verbal, but tactile. A worn sleeve, a winter wind, the weight of a book held too long. When he reached the 12th stone, he paused. There was no symbol, only a slight indentation, as though something once rested there and had been removed, or was waiting to return. Ellis sat in the center of the circle, and the house listened, not with walls, but with memory. And somewhere far above, a clock ticked, not to measure time, but to remember rhythm. He did not move, because for the first time there was nowhere else to go, and nothing more to find, only something to become. The air in the circle shifted, not with wind, but with weight. Ellis closed his eyes, and in the silence, something opened. Not a door, not a vision, a sense, as if the room itself had turned inward to face him, not physically, but with attention. And in that attention, he was no longer just Ellis. He was the echo of every person who had ever entered that house. He was the breath left behind in each room. He was the hesitation at the top of a staircase, the hand lingering on a doorknob, the glance into a mirror that didn't return exactly what was offered. He did not imagine these things. They remembered themselves through him. Memories were not shown to him. They passed through. A woman humming in the attic with a needle in her hand, stitching love into curtains. A child spinning in the hallway, trying to catch light on her fingertips. A man pacing the study, whispering apologies to a name no longer spoken. Each flickered through him without warning, without order, without judgment. They did not ask to be known, only to be felt, briefly, and allowed to pass. His body remained still, but within, whole seasons shifted. He heard laughter from a room that had burned long ago. He smelled rain on a letter never sent. He felt the ache of a goodbye that never made it to the lips. These were not his memories. But the house had no need for ownership, only witness. And Ellis, in that moment, became the perfect witness. Time did not collapse. It layered. He saw himself standing in the very circle, older, then younger, then not himself at all. The figure blurred, folded, unfolded again. The self was not fixed. It moved with the rhythm of the space. Somewhere beyond the room a door closed, not with sound, with decision. He was not meant to return, not because he couldn't, because he had arrived. And in the deepest quiet, something spoke, not aloud, but in every part of him. This is not the end. He opened his eyes. The room had not changed. The stones remained, but in the center, where he had been seated, a faint outline now lingered, like heat in the shape of memory. He stood slower than before, not weary, rooted. Outside the circle, the walls were beginning to return. Shapes formed. Furniture reappeared, not newly, but familiarly. A chair where a mother once nursed, a clock that only chimed for farewells, a doorway that led to forgiveness. Ellis stepped through them, not to explore, but to confirm. The house no longer held secrets. It held him. And as he walked, the light followed, not ahead but behind, sealing what had been opened. Gently, gratefully. He was no longer remembering. He was remembered. No longer a guest, no longer a question. He had become the silence the house had always waited for, and the room that locked from inside finally opened. Not to let anyone in, but to let something out. Finally. Morning never truly arrived in the house, not as sunlight, but as softness. The kind that filtered in through curtains left undisturbed, through floorboards that no longer creaked but settled like sighs. Ellis did not wake. He transitioned, gently, from stillness to awareness, as though the night had carried him forward rather than passed him by. The house no longer offered questions. It offered continuity. In the kitchen, a cup was already waiting, warm, familiar. He didn't wonder who had placed it there. Some gestures were not acts of mystery, but memory, continuing itself. He sat by the window that faced nothing, only fog, and let the warmth steep into his hands. Today was not different. It was deeper. He moved through the house not as a resident or visitor, but as part of its breath. Every door he passed opened before he reached it, not with obedience, but anticipation. The walls had begun to soften, revealing layers beneath paint and plaster, faint imprints of hands, of drawings once scrubbed away, of measurements tallied in pencil and never erased. The library was unchanged, and completely new. Books he had never seen now lined the shelves, but when he pulled one down, he found his own handwriting inside, notes in the margins, questions he hadn't yet asked, a page half torn, as if removed in haste, yet folded neatly at the back. He didn't remember writing them, but they remembered being written. He sat on the floor between shelves, letting the book rest in his lap. It did not ask to be read. It only asked to be held. The pages turned themselves slowly, not by draft, but by decision. Each revealed a memory, not his own, yet familiar in the way old dreams sometimes are. A garden behind a house that no longer stood. A name once whispered into the hollow of a tree. A question written in charcoal on the back of a cupboard door. The room dimmed, not from light, but from the weight of so much presence. He closed the book, stood, and placed it not where he had found it, but where it belonged. A shelf that hadn't existed before now waited with space shaped to fit it. He didn't need to ask how it knew. Down the hall, the study had changed again. The desk was no longer empty. A sheet of paper sat at its center, blank but expectant. The pen beside it had no ink, yet left marks when lifted. Ellis approached, took the pen in hand, and without instruction or intent, began to write. Not words, not sentences, just lines, curves, shapes that meant nothing and everything, each stroke echoing something his body remembered before his mind could grasp. And when he was done, he set the pen down. The paper absorbed the markings like breath into skin. He did not read it. He did not need to. He had never written it before. But he had always been meant to, and the house, in silence, accepted it as its own. It had been waiting for this story for 100 years. The house no longer shifted. It settled, not as resignation, but as recognition. Ellis felt it in the way the walls no longer breathed around him, but with him. Each room he entered no longer offered surprise. It offered presence. He passed the hallway with the mirror, now veiled behind a sheer curtain that had never existed. Not hidden, softened, as though memory itself had become shy. Downstairs, the front door remained closed, though it no longer mattered. What was outside had ceased to define what was within. He did not test it. He had nothing left to leave. In the parlor, a record played. He had not placed it. It had always been playing, quietly, beneath the sound of his own thoughts. A melody without composer, familiar as a heartbeat half remembered in sleep. He stood beside the player but did not touch it. The needle did not skip. The vinyl bore no label. Yet each note unfolded like a thread leading back through time, not to a moment, but to a feeling. He sat on the floor, cross-legged, unburdened. The rug beneath him had patterns he had never noticed, loops and spirals that echoed the sketches he had made in the study. He traced them with a fingertip, not to understand, but to confirm they were real, or had always been. Above the fireplace, a frame hung, empty, but not blank. It shimmered, not with glass, but with possibility, like a canvas awaiting the memory bold enough to imprint itself. Ellis stood and faced it, and the house quieted further, as if holding its breath. He did not try to remember. He allowed remembering to come. A faint outline emerged, not an image, but a presence. Something, someone, who had once stood in that room, watching him now as he watched them then. Not a ghost, a witness. Time folded without edges, and he did not step forward. He stepped inward, into the frame, and through it. He found himself in a smaller room, one he did not recognize, yet which did not surprise him. A nursery, dustless, still. The crib untouched, but not unloved. A rocking chair swayed with no wind. He approached it, rested a hand on its back, and it stilled, not in fear, but in acknowledgement. This was not his memory, and yet it belonged to him now. He sat in the chair. The room did not speak. It listened, and he, for the first time, understood what it meant to be heard without being asked. On the table beside him, a single object rested, a watch, long stopped. Its face was scratched, its chain slightly rusted, but as he lifted it, it ticked once, and that was enough. He placed it in his pocket, not to keep, to carry. When he rose, the door was open behind him, not wide, just enough. He stepped through, and the room behind him did not disappear. It closed gently, like a memory ready to rest, and somewhere deeper in the house, another door opened. This one was meant for him. The new door was different. It did not appear. It arrived. Ellis found it not by turning corners, but by standing still. The hallway adjusted. The wallpaper curled back just enough. The floorboards beneath his feet sighed inwards, and where there had been only wall, now there was an opening, round, arched, as if formed by memory rather than design. He did not hesitate. The room beyond was neither grand nor small. It was exact. The dimensions matched something internal, a shape he didn't know he carried until he stepped into its echo. Inside, a desk, a chair, a mirror, and a second chair facing his. Nothing moved, yet everything felt recently arranged. Ellis sat in the chair closest to the mirror. The air in the room was warm, not with heat, but welcome. Across from him, the second chair remained empty, but its presence was undeniable. It held posture, history. It was not waiting. It was remembering. On the desk sat another journal, closed. Unlike the one from before, this one had no dust, no lock, no title. It existed as if it had only just been placed there, by a version of himself that had stepped out only moments ago. He opened it. The pages were blank, but the paper held weight, as if already saturated with words not yet written. He took the pen beside it. It was identical to the one in the study, yet slightly heavier, as if it knew this would be the last thing it wrote. When he touched its tip to the page, there was no ink, but still, a line appeared. Not drawn, revealed. He began to write. Not stories, not memories, moments, scattered and quiet. Each line marked a thread, something once overlooked, now reframed. A glance from his mother before closing a door. The pause his father took before answering. The crack in the ceiling of a childhood bedroom where dust made shapes at dusk. He didn't record them to keep. He wrote them to let go. The mirror across from him began to soften, not blur, not fog, but deepen, as though depth itself were pulling forward. He did not see his own reflection. Instead, he saw the chair, empty. And then, not. A figure sat. Not a stranger. Not exactly himself. A shape composed of recognition, the way he once looked before loss, before searching, before understanding what silence could hold. The figure did not move, but its presence moved through him. He did not feel seen. He felt returned. When the final line was written, the pen stopped, not emptied, but complete. Ellis closed the journal, and for the first time, the second chair was no longer across from him. It was under him, and the room folded around the silence like a hand closing over light, not to extinguish it, but to keep it warm. Ellis did not leave the room. The room left him. It receded not by distance, but by need. Walls softened, boundaries thinned. What had once been wood and paint became shadow and shape. He stood, though he did not remember rising. The journal was gone. So was the desk. Only the chair remained, and even it now felt like memory translated into furniture. He turned toward the threshold. There was no door, only a direction, and so he walked. The corridor was unfamiliar, but not unfriendly. It twisted without corners, curved without reason, like a hallway designed by breath and thought instead of blueprint. The walls pulsed with a faint glow. Not light exactly, but memory gently illuminated. Portraits hung here. Not painted. Impressed. He paused at each. A boy with one shoelace untied, holding a broken compass. A woman brushing dust from the hem of a dress she no longer wore. An old man staring out a window with rain running down the inside of the glass. None of the figures looked at him, but all of them had once been him, or would be. He walked on. The path narrowed, then widened again, without pattern, like thought. At one bend, the floor gave way to water, shallow, still. He stepped into it and did not ripple. The surface clung to his feet like parchment, unbroken. Beneath the water, he saw objects, ordinary things long since forgotten. A pair of keys, a button, a dried flower, a coin worn smooth. None held meaning alone, but together they felt like a sentence half remembered. He moved through the shallows until they receded. The hallway turned golden, though no light source revealed itself. It was warmth without origin. He passed a doorway on his left. Inside, a child's laughter echoed, though no child stood within. The sound was not a memory. It was a remainder, and when he turned to look, the door had closed behind him, softly, like gratitude. He reached a final space, not a room, not a hall, but a pause. A clearing made of breath. No walls, no ceiling, only air that remembered shape. At its center, a single object floated, neither suspended nor resting. A pocket watch, familiar. The same one he had carried, or would carry, or had given away. Time was not broken here, it was braided. He held out his hand. The watch came to rest in his palm. It did not tick. It pulsed. And with each pulse, he felt not age, but arrival. The silence around him thickened, not to suffocate, but to cradle. It said nothing, because everything had already been said. He closed his eyes, and for the first time, there was no room, only the space that had once required a room. And it was enough. Not full, not empty, complete. There was no return, but there was a continuation. Ellis did not wake. He did not rise. He emerged as a figure does from mist, not changed, but clarified. The house was gone, or perhaps he was simply beyond it. In its place stood nothing, and everything. A field of silence, vast and without edge, stretched before him like memory waiting to be made. He walked without footsteps. The air held no resistance. And yet, with each step, something beneath him took form. Stone paths, worn gates, invisible thresholds marking where thought became place. Above him, there was no sky, only a dome of remembrance. The air shimmered with potential. No colors, no sounds, just the texture of presence, as if every breath he took was being heard. He paused near a bend in the invisible path. Before him stood a bench, simple, wooden, perfectly placed. He sat without thinking. Across from him was no one, and yet the bench opposite did not feel empty. It felt recently vacated, still warm with presence, still echoing with pause. He spoke no words, but something answered anyway. It came not as voice, but as knowing. A wave of understanding that had no language but filled every space he'd ever left hollow. The path resumed when he stood again. It led nowhere, which meant it led everywhere. Each step forward recalled a place he had never been, but somehow remembered. A room with a green glass lamp and ticking clock, a porch swing that moved even without wind, a quiet street lamp that flickered in apology more than function. He was not visiting memories. He was forming them forward. Time did not pass here. It opened. A hill rose gently in the distance. At its crest, a doorway stood, freestanding, weathered, waiting. No frame, no hinges, just a door closed against nothing. As he approached, it did not grow larger. The world adjusted around it. He reached out his hand. The handle was cool, and when he opened it, there was no threshold to cross, only stillness, and then a single breath. Not taken, given. The field behind him was already fading, not from sight, but from need. He no longer walked. He no longer moved. He arrived. In a space where nothing was expected and everything was permitted, Ellis sat once more, though there was no chair, no ground, no orientation. And then the journal appeared. Not the old one, not the blank one, a new one, bound in the quiet between endings. He placed his hand on its cover. It pulsed, and the silence around him, the silence that had carried him, guided him, waited for him, whispered not words, but a gesture, the kind that welcomes, the kind that stays. He opened the book, and the first page wrote itself, his name, just once. And that was the beginning, not of a life, but of a story that never needed to end.